Hi, Joel.
Hi.
Thanks for helping my project.
Oh, thanks so much.
Could you say a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Joel Flynn. I just finished my PhD in economics at MIT, and I'm starting next year as an assistant professor of economics at Yale University, following a one-year postdoc at Yale University.
What got your interest in economics? I mean, did you always know you wanted to be an economist, or was it like kind of a path to get there?
Yeah, I wasn't always sure. So when I was in high school, I was interested in technical things. Then I don't know quite how, but I settled in economics. I studied that as an undergraduate student, and then I was deciding between going into finance or going into economics when I finished university, and I just decided to go into economics, and I've been loving it.
Well, okay, so I got a bit of a interesting question for you. Do you think the economy is going to be limited to just the Earth, like forever, or at some point do you think it's going to expand to include resources and activities beyond the Earth?
I mean, insofar as it's, economical to do so and the incentives make sense, I think it will happen. I mean, whether or not that's the case is hard to say. Whether or not we will need resources from other planets or, other celestial bodies is hard to say. I mean, looking now at the trajectory of population on Earth, it's declining, in many respects in many advanced economies, and so it's unclear if there'll be a need to go beyond the Earth. So it's hard to say whether or not the incentives will be there. But if they are at some point, I have no doubt that we will begin exploring further in a commercial capacity.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't seem like population pressure is going to be the driver. I mean, Japan, the birth rate was half the death rate last year. So I mean, they're literally losing people twice as fast as they're like actually.
Yeah, and you see similar in Korea and much of Europe, and the U.S. were not for immigration would look a little more towards that as well.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, no. And what do you think drives that? Is it the cost of having kids, or is it like something else? I mean, because like to have a child in the U.S. is a lot more expensive than having a child, say, in Guatemala, as an example.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to say, and I think it's one of the big questions that people have to grapple with now, because demographic collapse is going to put serious constraints on many advanced economies in the next, several decades.
Yeah, I mean, the population increasing is something we've had for as far as we know, and I guess all of our systems are built around that. The idea of going the opposite direction would be
it's pretty scary.
Pretty scary. Well, okay, something a little bit more hopeful. Did you know that NASA's planning to send astronauts back to the moon for the first time since 1972?
No, I didn't know that. We were actually at the Houston Space Center today, because that's one of the things we wanted to do while we were visiting. But I didn't know they had concrete plans to do so.
Now that you do, what do you think about it?
I think, broadly speaking, space exploration is very cool and it's very inspirational. I am not entirely sure it's worth the resource cost. So I'm not entirely sure what we get out of further exploration to the moon from a scientific perspective that justifies the cost, but I do think it's really cool.
Okay. In 200 years, do you see what does humanity look like in 200 years from your perspective?
I really have no idea. I mean, you kind of have these sci-fi visions where you imagine Earth having colonized at least Mars, perhaps Venus, or other things that are potentially possible, and that would be fantastic. But I'm not sure if that would take place. I mean, I'm kind of just hopeful that we can remain intact on Earth without having engaged in nuclear war by that point. So.
And you talked about kind of like the economic drivers of space exploration. I mean, I guess there's like two like sides of that, right? You have like the cost and the reward. Regardless of what the reward is, if the cost is like significantly higher than that, there's like no reason. But if you could drive the cost lower, then there would be kind of like a benefit of going into space. And I was just wondering if you're familiar with like SpaceX's Starship, which is like 100% reusable spacecraft. They actually think they'll be able to launch multiple times per day. 100% reuse would be cheaper than any spacecraft ever launched from an operational standpoint. If the cost got sufficiently low, do you think there would be benefits? Do you think we would actually?
It obviously pushes in that direction. I'm not sure of any concrete resources that are lacking on Earth that we'd be able to extract and then bring back to Earth. Of course, if you think about having people in space as an end per se, then managing to extract materials in space and keep them in space is a lot cheaper than launching them into space from Earth.
Right.
And so conditionally having people in space, I understand fully why there'd be a demand for extracting resources within space. But in terms of launching missions to collect resources to bring them back to Earth, I'm not sure exactly for which resources that will be profitable.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. The only reason to send humans to space is to send humans to space. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that has to be like something that we see value in and of itself.
Either for exploration, or as I hope we'll make the diversification argument that you want to have people on other bodies, so if something bad happens on Earth,
Right.
you have people elsewhere.
Like asteroids, nuclear war,
For example.
or pandemics. Those would be like probably the three big ones.
Yeah, quite possibly. And I can see that value totally. I think at the same time, though, starting out in this conversation from like the private incentives, I think the private incentives will not be there to do that, but that could be an argument why there'd be a big social benefit
Right.
to having, and perhaps the most compelling one, for having space exploration.
I would also offer another one, perspective. Here on Earth, you know, we feel like that this is everything just looking out, but whenever you're like looking at the Earth from the moon, I mean, you really see how like small and fragile the Earth is. And you know, people say that like the moonrise photo that the astronauts took in like 1968 whenever they went around the moon the first time, it's really like the poster child for environmentalism and like trying to save the Earth. So I just wonder there might be some value in that as well.
I mean, if it does that, then for sure. If that's the case, then you could definitely make the argument, yeah.
If you could, would you take a trip to space?
If I could, I'd want to see if it's, safe first. But conditional on being safe, I don't see any reason why not. And actually, it will be obviously amazing. I think the major thing at first that would deter at least me is, wondering if it's going to be fully safe or not. I mean, you've seen recently with the billionaires on the submarine how even tasks on Earth can be pretty dangerous.
It is.
And yeah.
I had some people say they would have gone before last week, but then after the submarine, they're like, no, I don't think so.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a shift of perspective, right? But, all these things carry an element of risk. And, like with airplanes, I mean, we only really developed those at the beginning of the 20th century. And now that's the safest form of transportation per mile that we have.
Right.
So there's no reason to suppose you couldn't try to do something similar with space exploration at some point in the future. But it's probably not right now.
Yeah, that's true. How many people would have to go without an incident for you to be like, it's safe enough? Is that like a few hundred, a few thousand, millions?
A few thousand, probably.
That's cool.
From my perspective, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, Joe, I really appreciate your time. This is kind of, I see this as being like a time capsule for generations, like 100 years, 200 years, look back on how people were kind of like processing, but I think it's going to be a transformational decade. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think would be good to kind of share?
No, I mean, I think we talked about most of the main things. I think the main existential threat to worry about right now, as it has been since the 1940s, is war between major advanced economies. And so that's what worries me most substantially. Fingers crossed, but it's hard to say what will happen.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.